The bullet grazed his cheek so close that Ethan Cole felt the heat before the pain, and when he touched his face in the dusty aftermath of the ambush, his fingers came away red with more than just blood. It was 1878 in Redemption Creek, Arizona Territory, and the scar that would form over the next brutal weeks would change everything about how the world saw him, and more importantly, how he saw himself. The outlaw gang that ambushed the stagecoach he was guarding had left him for dead in the canyon. They took the silver shipment, killed the driver, and rode off laughing while Ethan lay bleeding in the red dirt. A passing prospector found him 3 days later, delirious with fever and infection spreading across the right side of his face. The old man dragged him to town, but by then the damage was done. The wound healed poorly, leaving a twisted mass of scar tissue that ran from his right temple down to his jaw, pulling at his eye and mouth in a way that made children cry and women turn away. Ethan had been handsome once. He knew that without vanity because people had told him so his whole life. At 26, he had been the kind of man who turned heads when he walked into a saloon, who had his pick of dance partners at the town socials. Now, 8 months after the ambush, he wore a bandana pulled up over the lower half of his face and kept his hat brim low. He rarely spoke to anyone beyond what was necessary for his work as a ranch hand at the R spread outside town. The other cowboys gave him space. Not out of fear exactly, but out of an uncomfortable uncertainty about how to act around him. Ethan preferred it that way. He ate his meals last, after the others had cleared out of the bunkhouse. He took the night watches that nobody else wanted. He made himself as invisible as a man could be while still drawing breath and earning wages. It was a scorching afternoon in late June when everything changed. Ethan was mending fence in the far pasture, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the bandana protecting his face from the dust. He heard the horse before he saw it, the panicked whinny cutting through the heavy air. Then came the sound of something crashing through the brush, and a woman's voice calling out in frustration rather than fear. Ethan dropped his tools and moved toward the sound, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his hip. He pushed through a stand of mesquite and found himself facing a scene that would have been comical under different circumstances. A paint mare stood chest-deep in the creek, refusing to budge, while a young woman stood on the bank with her hands on her hips, arguing with the animal as if it could understand reason. "You stubborn, ridiculous creature," she was saying, her voice carrying a musical quality even in exasperation. "We have been through this exact creek a dozen times. There is nothing in there but water and possibly some very confused fish." The woman was small and fine-boned, with dark hair escaping from a practical braid and skin that spoke of hours spent in the sun. She wore a split riding skirt and a simple cotton blouse, both dusty from travel. When she turned and saw Ethan standing there, she did not scream or step back. Instead, she smiled with obvious relief. "Oh, thank goodness. I do not suppose you have any experience with hysterical horses. Daisy here has decided that this particular stretch of water contains monsters, despite all evidence to the contrary." Ethan froze. He had not been this close to a woman since the scarring. His hand came up automatically to check that his bandana was secure, pulling it higher even though it already covered everything below his eyes. He nodded once but did not speak. The woman seemed to sense his discomfort but misread its source. "I am sorry, I should have introduced myself properly. I am Clara Bennett. My father just bought the old Morrison place about 5 miles east of here. We arrived from Kansas 3 weeks ago, and I am still learning the geography." She paused, studying him with frank curiosity. "You work for the R?" Another nod. Ethan cleared his throat, the sound rough from disuse. "I can help with the horse," he managed, his voice muffled behind the bandana. Oh, wonderful. Clara's smile brightened, and Ethan felt something twist in his chest that had nothing to do with his old injury. I warn you, she is being particularly unreasonable today. Ethan approached the creek slowly, making soft, clicking sounds with his tongue. The mare's ears swiveled toward him, and he kept his movements calm and unhurried. He waded into the water without hesitation, letting the coolness soak into his boots and pants. The horse watched him but did not shy away. When he reached her, he ran his hand along her neck, feeling for signs of injury or distress. His fingers found a burr tangled in her mane, pressing against a sensitive spot behind her ear. He worked it free carefully, and the mare immediately relaxed, blowing out a breath. Ethan gathered the reins and led her out of the creek without resistance. "Well," Clara said, laughing in delight. "I feel rather foolish now. I spent 20 minutes trying to coax her out, and you managed it in under 2. What was the trick?" Ethan handed her the burr without speaking. Clara examined it and then looked at him with something like admiration in her eyes. They were green, he noticed, the color of new leaves in spring. "You are very observant," she said softly. "Thank you, truly." He nodded again and turned to go, but her voice stopped him. "Wait, please, I do not even know your name." "Ethan." The word came out before he could stop it. "Ethan," she repeated, and the way she said it made it sound like something worth remembering. "Will you be working out here tomorrow?" "I pass by this way often, and it would be good to know there is someone nearby who understands difficult horses better than I do." He should have said no. Should have grunted something non-committal and walked away. Instead, he found himself nodding once more. Clara smiled again, and Ethan felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. She mounted Daisy with easy grace and touched her hat brim in farewell. "Until tomorrow, then, Ethan, thank you again." He watched her ride away, his heart pounding against his ribs in a way that felt both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. For the first time in 8 months, he had spoken to someone who had not looked at him with pity or disgust. Of course, Clara had barely seen his face. The real test would come when she inevitably discovered what lay beneath the bandana. And when that happened, she would react like everyone else. Better not to hope for anything different. But the next day, when the sun was at its highest point, Clara came riding through again. Ethan was working on the same section of fence, and he heard her approach long before she called out a greeting. This time she had a canteen of water and a cloth-wrapped package. "I thought you might appreciate some lunch," she said, dismounting. "Mrs. Henderson at the general store makes the most wonderful bread, and I have some cheese and apples to share." Ethan stood frozen, his tools hanging loose in his hands. This was beyond a simple thank you for helping with her horse. This was something else, something he could not quite identify. "I already ate," he lied. Clara tilted her head, considering him. "That may be true, but I am hungry, and I dislike eating alone. Would you mind terribly if I sat in the shade of that tree over there for a few minutes? The ride from our place is longer than I remembered." She did not wait for permission, just led Daisy to the cottonwood and settled herself on the ground with her back against the trunk. She unwrapped the food and began eating, humming softly to herself. After a long moment, Ethan found himself walking over, though he kept several feet of distance between them. Clara did not comment on his caution. She simply offered him an apple, which he took with a muttered thanks. He turned partially away, ready to lift the bandana just enough to eat without revealing his face. "You do not have to do that," Clara said quietly. "Turn away, I mean, I am not easily shocked. You have not seen what is under here." The words came out harsher than he intended. "No," she agreed. "But I imagine you have a face under that bandana, same as anyone else, just perhaps with a story attached to it." Ethan felt anger flare in his chest, hot and defensive. "It is not a story. It is a nightmare that women cross the street to avoid." "Then those women are fools," Clara said simply. She took a bite of bread and chewed thoughtfully. "My younger brother was kicked in the face by a mule when he was 12. The doctors said he would lose his eye, but he did not. He does have scars, though, quite dramatic ones. He worried for years that no one would ever want to marry him because of how he looked." "What happened to him?" Ethan asked despite himself. "He married the daughter of our town's pastor last spring. She told him that his scars proved he was strong enough to survive anything, and that was exactly the kind of man she wanted." Clara smiled at the memory. "They are expecting their first child in the autumn." Ethan said nothing. He ate his apple in silence, the sweetness of it foreign on his tongue after months of bitter coffee and tough beef. Clara did not push for conversation. She simply sat in the shade, eating her lunch and watching the clouds drift across the endless blue sky. When she finally stood to leave, she brushed the crumbs from her skirt and looked at him directly. "I will be by again tomorrow if that is all right. I enjoy the company, even if you do not say much." Day after day, Clara came. Sometimes she brought food. Sometimes she brought questions about the land, about the cattle, about the double R and its owners. Ethan found himself answering in longer sentences, his voice growing less rusty with use. Clara had a way of making silence comfortable but conversation irresistible. She told him about Kansas, about the farm her family had left behind when drought and debt made staying impossible. About her father's hope that Arizona Territory would offer new opportunities, even if starting over at 50 was harder than he wanted to admit. "We are down to our last reserves," she confessed one afternoon, sitting cross-legged in the grass while Ethan repaired a saddle. "Father will never say so outright, but I see the worry in his face. We need this ranch to succeed, and soon." "The Morrison place has good land," Ethan offered, "water rights to the creek, decent grazing. But we have only a dozen head of cattle and no real experience running a ranch. Father is a farmer, not a rancher. There is so much we do not know." She sighed, plucking at the grass. "I try to help, but I am learning as I go." "You are doing fine," Ethan said gruffly. "Takes time to learn a place." Clara looked up at him, and her smile was warmer than the afternoon sun. "That is kind of you to say." 3 weeks into their daily meetings, a summer storm rolled in without warning. The sky turned from blue to black in minutes, and the wind picked up with a fury that sent dust devils spinning across the pasture. Ethan was tightening the last staple on a gate when the first fat drops of rain hit. He looked up to see Clara riding hard toward him, her horse fighting against the wind. "The creek," she shouted over the rising roar of the storm. "Father and I moved our cattle to the north pasture this morning. If this rain is as heavy as it looks, they will be cut off when the water rises." Ethan understood immediately. Flash floods were deadly in this country. The creek could go from a trickle to a torrent in minutes, and cattle were too stupid to move to high ground on their own. He grabbed his horse from where it was grazing nearby and swung into the saddle. "Show me," he called to Clara. They rode together through the storm, rain lashing their faces and thunder shaking the ground beneath them. The creek was already rising when they reached the north pasture, brown water churning with debris. Clara's dozen head of cattle stood clustered near the bank, bawling in confusion. "We have to get them across now," Ethan yelled. "Once the water gets higher, they will not move." Clara nodded, her face set with determination. Together they worked the cattle, whooping and waving their arms to get the animals moving. The first few cows balked at the water, but once one finally plunged in, the others followed. Ethan and Clara pushed them hard, their horses splashing through water that was rising by the minute. They were nearly across when Clara's mare stumbled. The horse went down hard, throwing Clara into the churning creek. Ethan saw her surface, gasping, and then the current caught her. He did not think. He just spurred his horse forward and dove from the saddle. hitting the water in a flat dive that knocked the air from his lungs. The creek was stronger than he expected, the current like living hands trying to pull him under. He fought toward where he had seen Clara go down, his arms burning with effort. Something hit his shoulder, a piece of driftwood or debris, and then he saw her. Her hand broke the surface, grasping for anything. Ethan lunged and caught her wrist, hauling her toward him. "I have got you," he shouted over the roar of the water. "Hold on to me." Clara's arms wrapped around his neck, and he kicked hard for the bank. The current tried to drag them downstream, but Ethan was strong from years of ranch work, and desperation gave him strength beyond that. His boots finally found purchase on the muddy bottom, and he dragged them both out of the water and up onto the grass. They lay there gasping, rain still pounding down on them. Clara was coughing up creek water, and Ethan rolled her onto her side, supporting her while she heaved and sputtered. When she could finally breathe properly again, she looked at him with wide eyes. "You saved my life," she said, her voice hoarse. "You would have made it out," Ethan said, but they both knew that was not true. Clara reached up, and before Ethan could stop her, she touched his face. Her fingers found the bandana, now soaked and slipping down. He jerked back, but she held firm. "Wait," she said softly. "Do not," Ethan said, and his voice cracked. "Please." "I want to see you," Clara said, "the real you." Her fingers were gentle as she pulled the bandana down. The wet fabric gave easily, falling away to reveal what Ethan had hidden for so long. He closed his eyes, unable to watch her face change from warmth to horror. He heard her sharp intake of breath and felt his heart break just a little more. But then her hand was on his face, fingers tracing the twisted scar tissue with infinite tenderness. "Open your eyes," Clara whispered. He did, expecting to see pity or disgust. Instead, he saw something that looked remarkably like wonder. "You are handsome," Clara said, her voice fierce and certain. "Do you hear me, Ethan Cole? You are handsome." "You do not have to lie to be kind," he said roughly. "I am not lying." She moved closer, both hands cupping his face now, her thumbs tracing along his jaw. "You have the most beautiful eyes I have ever seen. They are the color of the sky just before a storm. And your face tells a story of survival, of strength. How could that be anything but handsome?" Ethan felt something break open inside his chest, something that had been locked away and frozen since the ambush. "Clara," he said, and her name was both a question and a prayer. "Yes," she answered, though he had not asked anything aloud. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, her lips soft and warm against his. The rain continued to fall, but Ethan barely felt it. All he knew was Clara in his arms, her hands gentle on his ruined face, her kiss telling him everything her words already had. When they finally pulled apart, he was shaking. "I am not a whole man," he said, needing her to understand. "People look at me and see a monster." "Then people are blind," Clara said firmly. "I look at you and see the man who helped a stranger with her horse, who shared his silence and his wisdom, who rode into a flood to help save my family's cattle, who risked his life to save mine. That is what I see, Ethan. That is who you are." He kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation in it. This time he let himself believe, just a little, that maybe she meant what she said. They rode back to the Double R together, their horses tired and their clothes soaked through. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and glittering. The ranch foreman, a gruff man named McCready, came out of the barn when he saw them approach. "Cole," he called, "where the hell have you been? We got fences down all over the property." "Helping Miss Bennett with her cattle," Ethan said, and he realized he had forgotten to pull his bandana back up. McCready's eyes widened slightly when he saw Ethan's face fully revealed, but to his credit, he only nodded. "Well, get yourself dried off and then get back out there. We got work to do." He tipped his hat to Clara. "Miss, you should head home before another storm rolls in." Clara nodded but turned to Ethan before she left. "Come by our place tomorrow. I know Father would want to thank you properly for your help." "I will," Ethan promised, and when she smiled at him, he felt like he could face anything. The next evening, Ethan rode to the Bennett ranch with his heart hammering in his chest. He had left his bandana behind in the bunkhouse, and every person he passed on the road gave him a second look. He kept his chin up and his eyes forward, Clara's words echoing in his mind. "You are handsome." The Bennett place was smaller than the Double R but well-maintained. The house was a simple adobe structure with a covered porch, and Clara was sitting on the steps when he rode up. She jumped to her feet with a grin. "You came," she said, as if there had been any doubt. "Said I would," Ethan replied, swinging down from his horse. Clara's father emerged from the house, a tall man with silver threading through his dark hair and the calloused hands of someone who had worked hard his whole life. He looked at Ethan's face without flinching and extended his hand. "Thomas Bennett," he said, "Clara tells me you helped save our herd yesterday." "Just doing what needed doing," Ethan said, shaking his hand. "Well, we are grateful nonetheless. Come inside. We have stew on and I would like to discuss something with you." Over dinner, Thomas explained his situation. He was a farmer trying to learn ranching with limited capital and less experience. He needed help, someone who knew the land and the animals and could teach him the things he did not know. He offered Ethan a job as his ranch foreman with a small cabin on the property and a percentage of the profits once the ranch started turning around. "I cannot pay much right now," Thomas admitted. "But I am good for my word. In a year or two this place will be profitable, I am sure of it." Ethan looked at Clara, who was watching him with hope in her eyes. He thought about the bunkhouse at the Double R, about the lonely nights and the careful distance he kept from everyone. Then he thought about waking up every morning and seeing Clara's smile. "I accept," he said. He gave his notice at the Double R the next day, and McCready surprisingly wished him well. "You are a good worker, Cole. That Bennett outfit is lucky to have you." Ethan moved into the small cabin on the Bennett property a week later. It had one room with a stove and a bed, but it was his, and it had a window that looked toward the main house. He threw himself into the work with a focus he had not felt in months. He taught Thomas how to read the land, how to spot illness in cattle, how to manage water and grazing. He built fences and repaired buildings and worked from dawn until well past dark. And every evening, Clara would come to the cabin with dinner or coffee or just her company. They would sit on the small porch and watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence. And slowly, carefully, they built something between them that felt solid and real. "Tell me about the ambush," Clara said one night, 2 months after Ethan had come to work for her father. He had known the question would come eventually. He stared out at the darkening sky and began to speak, telling her things he had never told anyone. About the way the bullets had sounded like angry hornets. About lying in the canyon, convinced he was going to die. About waking up with his face on fire and the horror in the doctor's eyes when he first changed the bandages. "I was vain before," Ethan admitted. "I thought my looks were important. I thought they defined me. When that was taken away, I did not know who I was anymore." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you know who you are now?" "I am starting to figure it out," Ethan said, and he took her hand in his. "You helped with that." "Good," Clara said simply, and she leaned her head on his shoulder. As autumn arrived and the heat finally broke, the Bennett ranch began to show signs of real promise. The cattle were healthy and multiplying. Thomas had learned quickly, his farming instincts translating better to ranching than he had expected. They sold a small herd at market and made enough profit to buy supplies for the winter and even put a little aside. One crisp October evening, Ethan rode into town to pick up supplies. It was the first time he had been to Redemption Creek since starting work at the Bennett place, and he felt a familiar tension creep into his shoulders as he tied his horse outside the general store. He was not wearing a bandana, but old habits made him want to duck his head and hurry through his business. Instead, he forced himself to walk into the store with his chin up. The owner, Mr. Patterson, looked up from his ledger and nodded a greeting. Ethan Cole, been a while, heard you are working over at the Bennett place now. That is right, Ethan said, waiting for the usual reaction to his face. But Patterson just turned to pull items from the shelves. How is Thomas getting on? He seemed like a decent fellow when he came through here buying seed. They talked about the ranch, about the weather, about the price of cattle. Patterson never once stared at Ethan's scars or showed any discomfort. When Ethan left with his supplies, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe people had grown used to seeing him around. Or maybe he had finally stopped expecting them to recoil. He was loading the wagon when he heard a familiar voice call his name. He turned to see Sheriff Dalton walking toward him, a grim expression on his weathered face. "Cole," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "Glad I ran into you, got some news you might want to hear." Ethan straightened, his hand instinctively moving toward his hip, though he was not wearing his gun. "What kind of news?" "We got 3 of the men who ambushed your stagecoach. Caught them trying to rob a bank over in Silver City. They are in custody, awaiting trial. Thought you might want to testify, seeing as you are the only survivor." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. He had tried not to think about those men, about the ambush, about anything connected to that day. But justice mattered. The driver who had died deserved justice. "When is the trial?" he asked. 3 weeks from now. You would need to travel to Silver City, probably be gone about a week total." Ethan nodded slowly. "I will be there." When he told Clara and Thomas about it that evening, Clara's face went pale. "Do you have to go? Will it be dangerous?" "They are in custody," Ethan said, "and yes, I have to go. I owe it to Bill Henderson. He was the driver, he had a wife and 3 children." "Then I am coming with you," Clara said firmly. "Clara, it is a hard journey and—" "I am coming with you," she repeated, and something in her tone told Ethan that arguing would be pointless. Thomas agreed to manage the ranch while they were gone. 3 weeks later, Ethan and Clara set out for Silver City on horseback, their saddlebags packed for the journey. It was a 4-day ride across rough country, and they camped under the stars each night. On the second night, as they sat by the fire, Clara said, "Are you afraid to see them again?" "The men who did this to you." Ethan poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks spiral into the darkness. "I used to think about what I would do if I ever found them. I imagined all kinds of revenge, and now I just want them to face what they did. I want Bill Henderson's family to have some kind of closure." He paused. "And I want to close that chapter of my life. I am ready to move forward." Clara moved closer to him, and he put his arm around her shoulders. "I am proud of you," she said softly. The trial was held in a stuffy courtroom packed with curious onlookers. Ethan sat in the witness stand and recounted the ambush in detail, his voice steady even when the defense attorney tried to rattle him. He pointed out each of the 3 defendants and identified them as being part of the gang that had attacked the stagecoach. When the prosecutor asked him to describe his injuries, Ethan did so without flinching, his ruined face serving as evidence more powerful than any words. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. All 3 men were found guilty and sentenced to hang. As they were led out of the courtroom, one of them, a scarred man with cold eyes, looked at Ethan and spat. "Should have made sure you were dead," he snarled. Ethan met his gaze calmly. "You should have," he agreed, "but you did not, and now you will hang for it." Outside the courthouse, Clara took his hand. "How do you feel?" "Like I can breathe again," Ethan said, and he realized it was true. Some weight he had been carrying for over a year had finally lifted. They stayed in Silver City one more day, long enough to visit Bill Henderson's widow and give her the reward money that had been offered for the capture of the outlaws. The woman wept and thanked Ethan, and he left feeling like maybe, finally, some measure of balance had been restored to the world. On the journey back to the ranch, Ethan and Clara rode side by side through country that was beginning to show the first hints of winter. The sky was a brilliant blue, and the air had that crisp quality that made everything seem sharper and more real. "Clara," Ethan said as they stopped to water the horses at a creek, "I need to ask you something." She looked at him with those green eyes that had haunted his dreams for months. "Yes, I do not have much to offer. I am a ranch foreman with a scarred face and a past that includes getting left for dead in a canyon. But I love you. I have loved you since the day you called me handsome in the rain. And if you will have me, I would like to marry you." Clara was quiet for so long that Ethan felt his heart begin to sink. Then she laughed, a joyous sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "Ethan Cole, I have been waiting for you to ask me that since the day I met you. Yes, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her there beside the creek, with their horses grazing nearby and the sun warm on their faces. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan felt completely, perfectly whole. They were married in Redemption Creek on a cold December day, with most of the town in attendance. Ethan stood at the altar without a bandana, his scarred face visible to everyone. And if anyone found it shocking, they kept it to themselves. Thomas Bennett walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, the little church erupted in applause. The reception was held at the town hall, with fiddle music and dancing and more food than Ethan had seen in months. McCready from the Double R showed up with half the ranch crew, and they all shook Ethan's hand and congratulated him. Even Sheriff Dalton made an appearance, bringing a bottle of good whiskey as a gift. "You did good, Cole," the sheriff said. "That testimony of yours made all the difference at trial." "I just told the truth," Ethan said. "Sometimes that is the hardest thing to do." Dalton raised his glass. "To you and your bride, may you have many happy years together." Ethan and Clara spent their wedding night in the little cabin on the Bennett Ranch, which Clara had transformed over the past weeks with curtains and rugs and small touches that made it feel like a real home. As they lay together in the darkness, Clara traced the scars on his face with gentle fingers. "I meant what I said that day in the rain," she whispered. "You are the most handsome man I have ever known. You are the bravest woman I have ever met," Ethan replied. "You saw past what everyone else could not." "I saw you," Clara said simply. "The real you, that is all." The years that followed were good ones. The Bennett Ranch prospered under Ethan's management and Thomas's determination. They expanded their herd and bought additional grazing land. Thomas, growing older, gradually turned more of the ranch's operation over to Ethan and Clara, content to spend his days tending a vegetable garden and carving wooden toys for the grandchildren he hoped would soon arrive. Clara gave birth to their first child in the autumn of 1880, a boy they named William after Bill Henderson. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and from the moment Ethan held his son for the first time, he felt a fierce love that threatened to overwhelm him. "He is perfect," Clara said, exhausted but radiant in the bed. "He looks like you," Ethan said, unable to take his eyes off the tiny, red-faced infant in his arms. "He has your stubborn chin," Clara replied with a tired laugh. Their daughter arrived 2 years later, a squalling bundle of energy they named Rose. She had Clara's temperament and Ethan's intensity, and she kept them both running from the moment she learned to walk. Thomas doted on both grandchildren, spending hours with them in his garden and teaching them about growing things. One evening when William was 5 and Rose was 3, Ethan found his son staring at him with the kind of intense focus that children have when they are working up the courage to ask a difficult question. "What is it, Will?" Ethan asked, setting aside the bridle he was mending. "Papa, why does your face look different from other people's faces?" Ethan felt his throat tighten, but he had known this question would come eventually. He knelt down so he was at eye level with his son. "When I was younger, some bad men hurt me. This is the scar from where I was hurt. Did it hurt a lot?" "Yes, it did, but it healed and now it does not hurt anymore." William reached out and touched the scar tissue, his small fingers curious but not afraid. "It is bumpy." "It is," Ethan agreed. "Does it make you sad?" Ethan thought about how to answer that. "It used to make me very sad. I thought it meant I was ugly and that no one would ever love me. But then I met your mother and she taught me that I was wrong. The scars do not matter. What matters is what is inside a person." "Mama says you are handsome," William said matter-of-factly. "Your mama is very wise," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think you are handsome too, Papa," William said, and then he threw his arms around Ethan's neck and hugged him tight. Ethan held his son close, his eyes burning with tears he refused to let fall. This, he thought, this is what happiness feels like. As the children grew, the ranch continued to thrive. Ethan became known throughout the territory as a man who knew cattle and land, who could read weather and market conditions with equal skill. People came to him for advice, and he gave it freely. His scars became simply part of who he was, something people noticed and then forgot about when they got to know him. Thomas Bennett passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1887, surrounded by his family. He had lived long enough to see his ranch become one of the most successful in the territory, and to know that his daughter and grandchildren were well cared for. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch with a simple stone that read, "Thomas Bennett, 1829 to 1887. He found his new beginning." Clara grieved her father deeply, but she took comfort in knowing he had died happy. And she threw herself into running the ranch alongside Ethan, the two of them partners in every sense of the word. In 1889, their third child was born, another boy they named Thomas after Clara's father. He was a quiet baby, content to watch the world with solemn eyes, and he grew into a thoughtful child who loved books and learning as much as he loved horses and wide-open spaces. William, now 9, was already showing signs of becoming a natural horseman. He could gentle the most skittish colt and had a way with animals that reminded Ethan of himself at that age. Rose, at 7, was fearless and wild, always the first to volunteer for any adventure. And young Thomas, at 2, was still finding his way in a household that sometimes felt too big and loud for his gentle nature. Ethan taught his children to ride and rope and read the land. Clara taught them to read and write and think for themselves. Together, they built a family that was strong and loving and utterly unlike anything Ethan had imagined in those dark days after the ambush. One evening in late summer, as the sun was setting and the children were finally in bed, Ethan and Clara sat on the porch of their home, which was no longer the small cabin but a proper house they had built as the family grew. Clara was mending one of Rose's dresses, and Ethan was simply enjoying the peace of the moment. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if I had not ridden past that day with my stubborn horse?" Clara asked suddenly. Ethan considered the question. "I probably would still be working at the Double R, hiding behind a bandana and avoiding people." "That makes me sad to think about," Clara said softly. "It makes me sad too," Ethan admitted. "But it did not happen that way. You did ride past. You did see me. And you changed everything." Clara set aside her mending and moved to sit beside him, her head on his shoulder. "We changed each other," she corrected. You taught me what real courage looks like. You showed me that strength is not about being unbreakable. It is about breaking and then finding the will to keep going. You taught me that I was more than my scars, Ethan said. You taught me that being seen, truly seen, is the greatest gift one person can give another. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. In the distance, they could hear the lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through grass. This land, this life, this family, it was everything Ethan had never known he wanted until Clara showed him it was possible. I love you, he said, the words as easy and natural now as breathing. I love you too, Clara replied, my handsome cowboy. Ethan smiled, and it no longer hurt to do so. The scars would always be there, a permanent reminder of the day he nearly died. But they were also a reminder of the day Clara Bennett rode into his life and taught him that being broken does not mean being less. Sometimes, it just means having more room in your heart for love. Years continued to pass in a rhythm of seasons and growth. William grew into a young man who had his father's skill with horses and his mother's head for business. At 19, he announced his intention to marry the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a spirited young woman named Kate who could ride and rope as well as any man. Ethan and Clara gave their blessing gladly, remembering their own young love. Rose, at 17, had no interest in marriage yet. She was too busy learning everything she could about ranching, determined to prove she was just as capable as any man. She reminded Ethan so much of Clara that it sometimes made his chest ache. Thomas, now 12, had discovered a passion for drawing and spent hours sketching the landscape and animals around him. He talked about maybe going east for proper art training someday, and though it scared Ethan to think of his son so far away, he would not stand in the way of the boy's dreams. In the summer of 1895, on a day when the heat shimmered off the land, and the sky was that endless blue that seemed to go on forever, Ethan and Clara rode out to check on the cattle in the far pasture. It was the same place where they had first met, where Clara's horse had refused to cross the creek and Ethan had helped her. "Remember this place?" Clara asked, her eyes sparkling with memory. "Every day," Ethan said. "This is where my life really began." "Mine too," Clara said softly. They dismounted and walked to the creek, which was running low in the summer heat. Ethan thought about the man he had been 17 years ago, hiding behind a bandana, convinced his life was over. He thought about Clara reaching out to touch his face in the rain, calling him handsome when he felt like a monster. "Thank you," he said suddenly. Clara looked at him in surprise. "For what?" "For seeing me when I could not see myself. For loving me when I did not think I deserved to be loved. For building this life with me." Clara took his scarred face in her hands, the gesture as familiar now as her own heartbeat. "You gave me a life I never dreamed of, Ethan Cole. You gave me love and partnership and a family. You showed me what it means to be truly strong. I should be thanking you." "Then we will thank each other," Ethan said, and he kissed her there beside the creek where it all began. They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson. The house was visible in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney and lamplight glowing in the windows. Their children would be there, probably arguing over something trivial or helping with dinner preparations. Thomas's detailed drawings would be spread across the kitchen table. Rose's tack would be strewn across the porch, waiting to be cleaned. William would likely be in the barn, tending to his horses. It was a life full of noise and mess and constant activity. It was a life that demanded everything Ethan had to give and then asked for more. It was a life he would not trade for anything in the world. As they approached the house, young Thomas came running out to meet them, his latest drawing clutched in his hand. "Papa, Mama, look what I drew. It is the old oak tree by the north pasture." Ethan dismounted and took the drawing, studying it carefully. His sun had captured not just the tree, but the quality of light that filtered through its branches, the way it stood as a solitary sentinel in the vast landscape. "This is wonderful, son," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "You have real talent." Thomas beamed with pride, and Ethan ruffled his hair affectionately. Clara came to stand beside them, looking at the drawing over Ethan's shoulder. "We should frame this one," she said. "It can go with the others in the parlor." The walls of their home were covered with Thomas's drawings, a chronicle of his growing skill and his deep love for this land. Ethan was proud of all his children, but there was something special about knowing his youngest son could take the harsh beauty of this territory and transform it into art. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Ethan sat at his desk writing in the journal he had started years ago. Clara had encouraged him to record their lives, their history, so that someday their grandchildren and great-grandchildren would know their story. He wrote about the day's work, about the cattle and the land, and then he wrote about memory, about the way the past and present could exist together in a single moment. He wrote, "I was a man who thought his life ended the day he was scarred, but I was wrong. My life began the day a stubborn horse refused to cross a creek and brought Clara Bennett into my world. She taught me that scars do not define us. They are simply the marks we collect as we live, as we survive, as we learn to be brave. She traced my jaw and called me handsome, and in doing so, she gave me back myself. I'm a husband, a father, a rancher. I am scarred and loved and blessed beyond measure. This is my legacy. This is my truth." He closed the journal and looked up to find Clara standing in the doorway, watching him with a soft smile. "Come to bed," she said. "Tomorrow will come early." Ethan rose and followed her, his hand finding hers in the darkness. Tomorrow would indeed come early, bringing with it all the work and challenge and joy that made up their days. But tonight, he was simply grateful to be here, to have this woman by his side, to have built a life that once seemed impossible. In the bedroom, as they lay together in the darkness, Clara's hand found his face, her fingers tracing the familiar landscape of his scars. It was a gesture she had done 1,000 times, but it never lost its power. It still made Ethan feel seen, treasured, loved. "You are my handsome cowboy," Clara whispered, just as she had on so many nights before. "And you are my salvation," Ethan replied, pulling her close. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The ranch slept, the cattle settled for the night, the horses quiet in the barn. And in the house that Ethan and Clara had built together, their family rested, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and protected. The years that followed brought changes, as years always do. William married his Kate and started his own family. Rose eventually did fall in love with a quiet veterinarian who had come to the territory to study the diseases that affected cattle. They married and built a practice together, combining her knowledge of ranching with his medical training. Thomas went east to study art, but he came home every summer, and eventually he returned for good, opening a studio in Redemption Creek and becoming known for his paintings of the western landscape. Ethan and Clara grew older together, their hair turning silver, their faces marking the passage of years. But the love between them never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by time and tested by the challenges that life inevitably brought. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were 12 grandchildren now, ranging from infants to teenagers, and the house was full of noise and laughter. A photographer had been brought in from town to take a family portrait, and as they all gathered on the front porch, Ethan looked around at the faces of his family and felt his heart swell with emotion. Everyone's smile, the photographer called out, disappearing beneath the black cloth of his camera. Ethan did not smile for the camera. He smiled at Clara, standing beside him with her hand in his, her green eyes still as bright as they had been the day they met. She smiled back, and in that moment, Ethan knew that every scar, every struggle, every moment of pain and doubt had been worth it to arrive at this place, this life, this perfect moment of completeness. The photograph would hang in their home for the rest of their days, a testament to what they had built together. But the real legacy was not captured in that frozen moment. It was in the stories their grandchildren would tell, in the lessons they had taught their children about courage and love, and seeing past the surface to the truth beneath. It was in the land they had tended, and the community they had been part of, and the lives they had touched simply by refusing to give up on each other or themselves. As the sun set on that anniversary celebration, Ethan and Clara stood on the porch long after everyone else had gone inside. The land stretched out before them, golden in the fading light, and Ethan thought about the journey that had brought him here. From a scarred man hiding behind a bandana to a husband, father, and grandfather surrounded by love, it seemed impossible that one life could contain so much transformation. "What are you thinking?" Clara asked, leaning against him. "That I am the luckiest man alive," Ethan said simply. "We are both lucky," Clara corrected. "We found each other when we both needed finding." "I love you," Ethan said, "today, tomorrow, and every day after." "I love you too," Clara replied, "my handsome, scarred, perfect cowboy." They stood together as the stars began to emerge, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed to become who they were meant to be. The scars remained, visible reminders of a terrible day that had led to the best life Ethan could have imagined. And every time Clara traced those scars with her gentle fingers and called him handsome, Ethan was reminded that beauty is not found in perfection, but in the courage to be seen, to be vulnerable, to be loved exactly as we are. That was the gift Clara had given him all those years ago beside a creek with a stubborn horse. And it was a gift that continued to sustain him every single day of his blessed, scarred, beautiful life.